Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all those tuning in. Thanks for joining us. Well, get your safari hats on. We're about ready to journey into a new book, the Book of Numbers. With the help of some notes from J. Vernon McGee and Bible Project, we'll give you an overview first. The Book of Numbers is from the Hebrew word arithmo in the Septuagint, which means arithmetic, but it also uses the word bemidar, meaning in the desert. Now, living in Phoenix, I know all about the desert. By the way, it's December 1st, 2021, 77 degrees today. Did the Lord wake you up? Well, if he did, give him thanks and praise and give him glory for another day. So right away, the book's divided into three sections. 1 through 10, they're at Sinai, and it's a preparation to conquer the new promised land. They've been gone for over 400 years, so obviously some people crept in there and now have inhabited it and kind of taken it as if it was their own, but that was not promised to them. Chapters 10 through 25 talk about the people who really didn't want to go and wanted to go back to Egypt. So they were out in the wilderness. And then chapters 25 through 36, the new generation that believes God for the land of milk and honey and clusters of grapes, they were at the horizons of Moab. And so God tells them to prepare a mighty army. Incredible strategy, really, when you think about it. 2 censuses were taken, chapter 1 and then chapter 26. And like J. Vernon McGee says, the theme of this is Pilgrim's Progress. Now, J. Vernon McGee was a Bible preacher from long ago, and if he credits this to John Bunyan, well, it's way before his time, too. But it's true because in Pilgrim's Progress, the pilgrim walks, wanders, works, wars a little bit, witnesses, and worships, just like the Israelites did here. So they're still camped out at Mount Sinai. Kadesh-Barnea, we find out by chapter 20. 40 years it takes them to take an 11-day journey, mainly because of unbelief. Still not enough faith in God, despite what they saw in their deliverance from Egypt. Disobedience, grumbling, rebellion, idolatry. So that first census showed 603,550 men that came out of Egypt. However, it doesn't really include that most families have a wife and two kids, at least two kids. So really, it was 400,000 women, 200,000 the elderly, 800,000 kids, 500,000 mixed Egyptians. From all this from Jewish historians, they didn't count the Levites, but really that's about another 20, 30,000. So when you throw those guys in and estimate how many left Egypt, there's about 2.5 million to 3 million people. That's quite a few. So for these guys to always be afraid and not fight, I think whatever land they would have walked into, they would have easily conquered it. Don't think they had 3 million people in those other lands in Canaan. However, God challenges them. Are giants going to be bigger than you in life? Are you going to always be afraid? Are you going to conquer or be conquered? Here's a lesson that even the pagan or heathen knows, right? By census 2, though, between bickering and fighting and the deceased, there was only 601,730 men, so they had lost about 2,000 men. Basically, this is a handbook, a roadmap for pilgrims. You will find out toward the end, I believe it's chapter 31, 32, that they do fight and they do conquer the Midianites. That's their first group. And priestly scribes wrote about this after the Babylonian exile in 587 BC. So it took a while for this book to come about. By chapter 2, God shows the strategy of the camp. You got the tabernacle and his presence, and then on each side, east and west, there's 3 tribes, and north and south, 3 tribes. So in the form of a cross is the 12 tribes, and God organizes them into troops. So without further ado, let's go into Bible Project and see what the overview of the entire Book of Numbers course. Let's see here.
The Book of Numbers, this fourth book of the Bible, carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised to Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the promised land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness. And immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the promised land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the promised land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the promised land. Now you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion. And they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the promised land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin, but even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab, and the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling. But up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness. That's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets, and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
And there you go. I enjoy Bible Project. If you don't know those guys, you should definitely familiarize yourself with them because they do provide a pretty good synopsis of an overview of the book in a nutshell and rather quickly and kind of like almost artistic form. So, thanks for joining us for our overview. Please stay tuned. We have got a lot to cover today. The Lord bless you and keep you. Have a great day.